Hey there, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. You know the drill, right? You amazing listeners send us the sources, the stuff you're curious about, and we kind of distill it down to the good stuff, the insights that really matter, so you can actually wrap your head around a topic without, getting completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of communication, specifically how it's shaped and molded by something we often don't even think about: social structure.
Right, the kind of invisible scaffolding of our societies. And our guide for this journey is Eugene Nida, a pretty brilliant guy, linguist, anthropologist, you name it, and he spent a huge chunk of his career working on cross-cultural translation.
Oh, yeah, for decades. So he's got this unique perspective on how people from different worlds try to understand each other. And we've been digging into excerpts from his book, Message and Mission. It's pretty insightful.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, our goal is to really grasp how these social structures, the ones we're all embedded in, affect not just how we communicate, but also, and this is crucial, how we make sense of what other people are trying to tell us. Think about those times when you felt like you're talking past someone, even when you're both using the same words.
Yeah, or when things just get totally misconstrued. Nida's work can help us decode some of those frustrating moments.
For sure. So where does he even begin with all this?
Well, Nida starts with something so fundamental we often miss it. He says communication never, and I mean never, occurs in isolation. It's always this dance between individuals, but they're not just floating in space. They bring with them this whole massive context of their social world.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how does that actually play out? Does it give any examples we can relate to?
Oh, tons. Like, think about how a boss talks to their employee. Totally different, right, from how you chat with your best friend. Or the way a police officer interacts with someone they've pulled over versus, say, a kid asking their parent for a cookie.
Right, right. Totally different vibes. You just automatically know there are certain ways you're supposed to talk in those situations.
And those unspoken rules aren't just about politeness. They get to the core of who has the power to say what to whom. And this is where it gets super interesting. Nita points out that the exact same behavior can be interpreted in completely opposite ways depending on who's doing it, their position in society.
Yeah, like something that comes across as super aggressive from one person might seem totally confident and assertive from someone else, just because of their status. Or what might be seen as timid from one person could be seen as appropriate deference from someone else.
Yeah.
It's like the lens you're viewing it through completely changes the picture.
Exactly. And if we zoom out even further to the big picture, Nita argues that where you stand in society, your whole social location, has a huge impact on what you choose to communicate in the first place. He uses this analogy of individuals being part of a larger family.
Okay, family.
Yeah.
What does he mean by that?
Well, it could be your actual family, of course, but also your community, your profession, even your nationality. The point is, you're part of this larger group, and there's this kind of unspoken rule book about how you communicate within that group. It's like we're all playing roles in this big social drama, and the lines we deliver, well, they depend on the character we're playing.
Got it. So this idea of social structure and communication, it goes way deeper than just, everyday politeness. It gets at the heart of power dynamics and even how we see ourselves.
Yeah, and this is especially true when you start talking about religion. Nita really dives into this. He says that in a lot of traditional religions, the gods themselves are often seen as holding specific positions within the social hierarchy.
Whoa, the gods themselves. What do you mean?
Well, like, they might be considered the ultimate ancestors of the community, the guardians of its values and traditions. So they're not just these abstract deities out there somewhere. They're woven into the very fabric of how society is organized.
So then challenging those beliefs is kind of like shaking up the whole social order.
Yeah, it can be. And Nita argues this is a big reason why religious ideas can be so resistant to change. Because it's not just a shift in your personal beliefs. It can be seen as a betrayal of your ancestors, a threat to the established way of doing things.
Right. You're not just changing your own mind. You're potentially messing with the whole foundation of the community. He gives that really powerful example of the Hopi man, right?
Oh, right. The one who converted to Christianity while he was away at school, got baptized, the whole thing.
Yeah, and then when he came back to his village, he felt completely lost, like he didn't belong anymore. Described it as feeling like a man without a country. It really shows how deeply intertwined our beliefs and our sense of social belonging are.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
And it leads Nita to critique some of the ways missionary work has been done in the past. He says that sometimes, maybe even with the best intentions, missionaries ended up creating these separate Christian communities, like little bubbles almost.
So instead of integrating into the existing society, they kind of form their own separate societies.
Exactly. And he uses the example of India before independence. There was this idea that, Indian converts to Christianity needed to fully assimilate into the foreign missionary community to really live out their faith.
Ah, so like almost creating a Christian caste in a way.
Yeah, almost. And Nada's point is that this can actually be really harmful because it isolates people from their own social context. It's like trying to plant a flower in a pot and then expecting it to thrive in a completely different garden.
That's a great analogy. And he also talks about how the social role of the communicator can be a huge barrier, like that missionary in South America who was also, of all things, a wealthy landowner.
Oh, yeah, Patron. And because of his social status, he just couldn't connect with the local people on an equal level. It was always this top-down dynamic.
So even though he might have had a genuine message he wanted to share, his social role was kind of drowning it out.
Exactly. There was no real dialogue happening. And Nida really stresses the importance of that back and forth. He says true communication, the kind that actually leads to understanding and change, has to be reciprocal, two-way, like a conversation, not a lecture.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got this clear picture of how intertwined communication and social structure are. But societies obviously aren't all the same, right? So how does Nida break those down?
Right. He gives us two main ways to think about the different types of societies out there. The first one is whether they're urban, like big cities, or rural, more like the countryside.
Okay, city versus country. Got it. What's the other distinction?
Whether a society is mostly homogeneous, meaning people are generally similar in their beliefs and ways of life, or heterogeneous, meaning there's a lot more diversity.
So like a spectrum of similarity versus diversity.
Exactly. And these two distinctions, urban versus rural and homogeneous versus heterogeneous, they give us this really useful framework for understanding how communication might work differently in different settings.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, so let's unpack those a bit. What are the defining features of an urban society, according to Nida?
Well, he says they tend to have large populations, often with lots of people who don't know each other. And interactions are often more impersonal, more transactional. Think about places like New York City, London, or Tokyo. Bustling, anonymous, everyone rushing around.
Yeah, you're constantly bumping into strangers. Very different from small town life.
Exactly. And rural societies are the opposite, right? Smaller, more close-knit communities where people know each other. Interactions are more face-to-face, more about personal relationships. Think about a village in rural India or a small farming town in the Midwest.
Got it. So the density of interaction, the level of familiarity, all of that plays a role. Now, what about those other categories, homogeneous and heterogeneous?
Okay, so a homogeneous society is one where people share a lot of common ground. Similar values, beliefs, ways of life. Even if there are social classes, there's still this sense of a shared culture, a shared identity. Nida uses Sweden as an example.
So less friction when it comes to communication because people are coming from a similar place, so to speak.
Right. Now, a heterogeneous society, on the other hand, is all about diversity. You've got different ethnic groups, different religions, different cultural backgrounds, all mixed together. Think about the United States or Brazil or India.
Much more potential for misunderstanding, probably.
Definitely. You can't assume everyone's on the same page. You have to be much more aware of those differences.
Okay, I'm following you. So urban versus rural, homogeneous versus heterogeneous. These are like the key variables in Nida's equation.
That's a good way to put it. And then he goes on to use some really interesting visual models to help us grasp these concepts even better, like that inverted diamond he talks about.
The inverted diamond, what's that all about?
He uses it to represent social class structures. The smaller upper class at the top, then a bigger middle class, and then the largest group, the lower class, at the bottom. It's not meant to be super precise, more like a general impression of how society is layered.
And he says these layers can get even more complex in some societies, right? Like with subdivisions within the upper or lower classes.
Yeah, exactly. But the diamond is a good starting point. And then he compares those diamond shapes across different countries. Like he says, Haiti has a very narrow top and a super wide base, which means a tiny elite and a huge lower class.
Wow, that's stark.
Yeah. But then Denmark, he says, has a much less pronounced upper class and a much bigger middle class. And Mexico, he says, is kind of in between, with a growing middle class. So these visuals really drive home the point that social structures aren't universal. They're different everywhere you go.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So once we've got this mental image of these different social structures, Nita then gets into the nitty-gritty of how communication actually happens within them.
Right.
Right. And he gives us two fundamental principles to work with. The first one is about horizontal communication. He says that communication between people on the same social level, their peers, that's where you get the most genuine back and forth.
So like true dialogue, where everyone has a voice. Exactly. And Nida emphasizes that this two-way communication, it's essential for anything to actually change. He uses this example of a general who's trying to lead an army.
Oh, I remember that one.
Yeah, he says the general can't just bark orders from headquarters. He needs to know what's actually happening on the ground. He needs feedback from his troops.
Right. Otherwise, he's just operating in a vacuum.
And this applies to all kinds of organizations and social groups. You need information flowing up the chain as well as down. Otherwise, you get stuck in this one-way communication that doesn't really work.
Okay, horizontal communication. Got it. What's the other principle?
Vertical communication. This is about how ideas and information flow from the top down, from people with higher status to those with lower status. But Nida says this flow is often pretty one-sided, and it usually only happens between groups that are right next to each other in the social hierarchy.
So like trends trickling down from the elite to the masses, but not necessarily reaching everyone.
Exactly. And he gives this great example to illustrate it. This African man who's wearing a heavy winter coat in the sweltering heat just because it was a gift from a white official.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It's like the coat itself becomes a symbol of status, even if it's completely impractical.
Right. And Nida uses this to talk about religious communication, too. He says there's often this tendency for religious leaders to do all the talking, to deliver the message from on high, so to speak.
And if they're not listening to the people they're trying to reach, their message might just completely miss the mark.
Exactly. It becomes this one-way broadcast that doesn't actually connect. So even with the best intentions, vertical communication can be really limited if it's not balanced with some horizontal dialogue.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how Nida's framework applies to so many different situations. But now I'm curious about how this all works in those more traditional face-to-face societies he talked about earlier. The ones that aren't huge, anonymous cities.
Right. He calls those folk societies and primitive societies. But he's careful to point out that even within those categories, there are important distinctions.
Okay, so what's the difference between a folk society and a primitive society?
Well, folk societies, even though they're close-knit, they're still connected to urban centers in some way. They might provide raw materials or labor or depend on those cities for certain goods and services. But primitive societies are more self-sufficient, operating independently of those urban influences.
So kind of like a spectrum of autonomy.
Exactly. Though he does say that truly isolated primitive societies are getting harder and harder to find these days.
Right, globalization and all that.
Yeah. But he uses this different kind of visual to represent these societies. Instead of the diamond, he uses a pyramid with a wide base.
Okay, a pyramid. What does that tell us about how they're organized?
Well, it shows that in these societies, the lines between leaders and the rest of the people aren't as sharp as they are in urban, class-based societies. It's not so much about social climbing. Instead, it's more about family and kinship ties.
So it's more horizontal than vertical.
In a way, yeah. Like you have clans, extended families, that kind of thing. And leadership is often shared among a group of elders who represent those different family groups. Decisions are made more collectively through discussion and consensus building.
So how does information spread in that kind of setup?
Well, it mostly follows those family and clan lines. It's not top-down or even strictly horizontal. It's more like a web of connections.
Interesting. So knowing who's related to whom is super important.
Absolutely. And Nida even brings up the work of Donald McGavran, who was a missionary strategist. McGavran talked about using these existing family networks as bridges of God to spread the Christian message.
So tapping into those pre-existing relationships makes sense. Okay, so we've covered folk and primitive societies. What about those complex heterogeneous societies we were talking about before, the ones with all the diversity?
Right. He breaks those down into two main types. First, you have urban societies that have minority groups, which themselves have their own kind of urban-style social structures. Like, imagine a city with distinct ethnic neighborhoods, each with its own internal hierarchy and leadership.
Okay, so it's like layers within layers.
Exactly. And then the second type is urban societies that include what he calls face-to-face sub-societies. These might be immigrant communities or groups that have recently moved from rural areas and still hold on to their traditional ways of life.
So pockets of that more face-to-face, community-based way of interacting, even within the larger, more anonymous urban environment.
Exactly. And for both of those types, Nida gives us some really important things to keep in mind when it comes to communication.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are the key points for those urban societies with multiple urban structured groups?
Okay, so first off, he says you can't just assume a one-size-fits-all approach is going to work. You have to tailor your communication strategies to each specific group. You have to understand their values, their norms, their ways of interacting.
Makes sense. What else?
Well, he also says you have to be really aware of prestige dynamics, meaning that groups that see themselves as lower status might be heavily influenced by those they perceive as higher status. So you have to be mindful of those power imbalances.
Right, because those perceptions can really shape how a message is received.
Absolutely. And then his third point, and this is a big one, he says communication is usually most effective when it happens within the group itself.
So people are more likely to listen to and trust messages that come from within their own community.
Exactly. It's about tapping into those existing networks of trust and shared understanding.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. Relationships are key.
Absolutely. Now, for those urban societies with those face-to-face sub-societies, Nida gives us a different set of things to consider.
Okay, what are the big takeaways for those situations?
Well, he says the most important thing is to recognize both the differences and the connections between the dominant urban culture and these more traditional subgroups. Like, don't make the mistake of treating them as totally isolated.
Especially if they rely on the city for resources or jobs or things like that.
Exactly. But at the same time, don't just assume that communication methods that work in the broader urban setting are going to work in those more close-knit communities.
So find a way to bridge those worlds.
Exactly. And this is especially important when you're dealing with people who are kind of in between those worlds. You know, people who have recently moved from a rural area to the city and are still trying to find their footing.
So understanding their sense of identity is key.
Absolutely. You have to meet them where they are, so to speak. And Nida's overall point here is that effective communication in any diverse society, it requires recognizing and respecting those different social layers.
So tailor your message and your approach to the specific group you're trying to connect with.
Exactly. You can't just blast out a generic message and expect it to resonate with everyone.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So after laying out this whole framework, this whole way of understanding how communication works in different social settings, Nida gives us some really practical advice, right? Those 4 key principles for making communication more effective, no matter where you are.
Yeah, he wraps it all up with those 4 principles, and they're super useful no matter what kind of communication you're doing.
All right, let's hear them. What's the first one?
Build on personal friendship. He says that genuine human connection, that's the foundation of all effective communication. You have to establish trust and rapport.
Makes sense. People are more likely to listen to someone they feel connected to.
Exactly. And his second principle is about strategic targeting. He says when you're introducing new ideas, start with people who are well respected within their own social circles, people who have a lot of connections and influence.
So like find the influencers, the natural connectors.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're the ones who can really help spread the message within their own communities.
Okay, smart. What's principle number 3?
Be patient. Nida says you have to allow time for new ideas to sink in, to be discussed and debated within the group. Don't expect instant change.
It's a process.
Exactly. And his final principle is about working within the existing social structure. He says if you're trying to change beliefs or behaviors, you need to engage with the people who have the authority to make those changes within their group.
So go to the decision makers, the elders, the leaders.
Exactly, because they're the ones who can ultimately give the green light, so to speak. And Nida's really emphasizing here that the social standing and the personal qualities of those who adopt a new idea early on, those early adopters, they have a huge impact on whether that idea will spread or not.
So it's not just about the message itself. It's about who's carrying the message.
Exactly. And he sums it all up with this really powerful statement. He says, effective communication in the long run follows the existing social structure, meaning people are embedded in their social networks, and that's where they're most likely to be receptive to new ideas and actually live them out.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. So just to recap, we've been exploring Eugene Nida's fascinating framework for understanding how social structure shapes communication. From the big picture differences between urban and rural societies to the more nuanced dynamics of social class and community, it's clear that where we stand in society has a huge impact on how we communicate and how we interpret what others are saying.
Absolutely. And for you, our awesome listener, we encourage you to take these ideas and apply them to your own life. Think about those times when you've had communication breakdowns or misunderstandings. Could those be explained by some of the social dynamics we've been talking about?
Maybe at work or in your community or even just in those big social trends we all see happening around us.
Yeah, give it some thought.
And here's a final question to ponder. In our world, which is more interconnected than ever but also more diverse, how can a deeper understanding of these social structures help us bridge those communication gaps? Could it help us build stronger relationships, be more effective in our work, even make a positive impact on the world around us?
That's a good one.
Lots to chew on there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.